Welcome to what I watched in May. This is my first video of this type or any video, so please be forgiving. I am still learning. I wanted to go through all of the things that I watched and talk a little bit about what I thought of them, whether I liked them, whether I would watch them again. For general reference, I interpret the Letterboxd scale as out of 10 stars. 5 stars to me usually means very mediocre. 6 stars means good, but I wouldn't watch it again, and there were some things I didn't necessarily appreciate. 7 stars means that it was good and I might watch it again. And anything above 8 stars usually means that it's a film that's going on my list of rewatchable films of varying degrees of quality and entertainment value. But I'll try and tell you what niche each of the things I'm talking about fills, so you get an idea of whether or not it would be something you would enjoy. So let's get started. The first thing I watched in May was the 2019 film #Like. This was an indie film, and I ultimately gave it 6 stars. So the things that I liked about this film were that it wasn't very predictable. It's about a girl who is catfishing someone that she sees as responsible for her sister's death. And it gets a little confusing near the end, and there was some good gore, and I did really feel like it represented the female perspective. So I think if you value seeing stories by women, it's a good movie. The second thing I watched in May was the movie Abandon with Katie Holmes. So this movie is from 2002. And it is very cheesy, but I really enjoy it because I really like Katie Holmes as an actress. I think she's more talented than people give her credit for a lot of the time. It's sort of a sexual thriller about a college student who has a missing boyfriend in Charlie Hunnam. I also really enjoy him in this film. And then, of course, there's the odd casting choice of Benjamin Bratt. I hadn't seen this movie since I was very young and had just gotten into movies. It was the first movie I had seen with a twist of this kind in it. But looking back and judging it now, I would give it 5 stars. It's very mediocre. I enjoy it because of the early 2000s teen sexual thriller vibe that it has. So if that's something that you enjoy, you might like the film. But it's a very niche sort of enjoyment. So the next few things that I watched relate to a specific director who I just discovered this month that I really enjoy, and that is Antonio Campos. So Antonio Campos is a sort of indie director whose most recent project was The Devil All the Time. And I watched the 3 main features that he had that were available to me, starting with his first one, After School. It was sort of unintentional that I started with this one. I just wanted something that was an edgy teen film from the mid to late 2000s that fit that indie genre. I've seen a lot of these kinds of films and I generally enjoy them. Things like Bully and 13 and movies in that genre. So After School centers on Ezra Miller, who plays a prep school boy who sees something pretty intense happen and he's filming it. And then he also gets hired to film the memorial video for those classmates. So some things that I really liked about this film. The main thing is that the film and the shooting style is very experimental, and it really prevents you from experiencing Ezra Miller's interiority for the majority of the film. For the majority of the film, you don't get to see his emotional reactions. There are very few shots of people's faces or their emotions throughout the film, especially Ezra Miller, and he's our main character. So I thought it was really interesting, but could be alienating to some viewers to have that sort of detached style. And ultimately, the detached style is turned around at the end of the movie to make a really interesting point about the dynamic of adults and teenagers, specifically related to this teenage tragedy genre. And I gave it 8 stars. I might give it more if I watch it again, because I think I missed some key elements just trying to figure out the point of the experimentation. So after watching that film and enjoying it so much, I really wanted to see what else Antonio Campos had done. And so I watched Simon Killer from 2012 on Netflix. I gave this film 7 stars, meaning I might watch it again. I would say that there's a lot that's very good about the film that is similar to what is good about After School. It has different experimental techniques, like there's a focus on aesthetic and a really nice color palette going on in the film. Ultimately, the film makes a different point about the main character and interiority than After School, but it's an interesting point nonetheless. My biggest issue with this film was the pacing. I didn't think that it moved quickly enough. I like a good slow burn, but in this case I just felt like the same thing was happening over and over again, which really made the movie stall for me. And the ending does build to something super worthwhile though, which is why I might watch it again. And I definitely think it showcases Antonio Campos's brilliance as a director. Instead, I watched a few other things. So one thing I watched was Empire Records from 1995, which is a comfort movie for me, and it has 8 stars as a result of the fact that it is a comfort movie. I watch it over and over again, but other folks may not enjoy it, and that's perfectly fine. Despite all of the cliches and the characters kind of fitting types, I think that it's really funny and it works very well overall. So I really do enjoy Empire Records a lot, and if you like that niche of 90s, early 2000 teen movies and you haven't checked Empire Records out, you definitely should. The next thing that I watched was The Sons of Sam: A Descent into Darkness, the mini-series on Netflix that just came out this past month in 2021. I gave this 7 stars, and I had quite a bit of background with this story and this particular version of the Son of Sam shooting because I read Maury Terry's book. The miniseries had some information that was new to me, but I had read it in the past. I thought that the miniseries did a good job of representing some of the more interesting and strange coincidences that Terry found in his research. I also thought the other thing that they did well was including a more balanced perspective on Terry as a researcher, because especially his interview with David Berkowitz was a bit questionable in the way that he approached things to confirm his own belief and his own narrative about the shootings. I think everyone else should judge it on their own experience, but as someone who had read the book, I thought that it did a good job and was fairly balanced. And then the next thing that I watched was the final Antonio Campos movie, The Devil All the Time. I gave it 7 stars. I did enjoy it, and I think that I enjoyed some of the things that other folks did not enjoy about the film. For instance, I really enjoyed the pace. I thought that the pace was very novelistic and very tense. There was never a time where I could predict what was going to happen next, because the way that the characters are all intertwined in a novelistic sense, is highly unpredictable, and it gives us a lot of time with the characters. Things that I wish were a little different. I wish that the characters weren't so disposable within the narrative. I don't think that is necessarily Campos's fault. That might be how the novel is as well. And in an adaptation of a more novelistic story, that is always an issue. And ultimately, the point of the film is about the towns and the relationship between the two towns that are being featured, and not really about the characters. Well, I think a lot of us just wanted to see more of Robert Pattinson being absolutely unhinged, because that was a truly magnificent performance. Bill Skarsgård's also fantastic in the film, and really got me in the gut, as it were. So ultimately, I really decided that I like Antonio Campos as a director from watching all of these films. It was an interesting journey that I would definitely take again. The one thing I will say about The Devil All the Time is that it's much more conventional filmmaking than the other two films, which makes sense for the type of story he's telling, but might disappoint those who are invested in his more experimental sort of aesthetic. From 2004, and yes, I had never seen this film before, and that is for the simple reason that I thought it would be too intense for me. I have, over the years, gained a larger tolerance for gory films, but on top of that, because of Spiral coming out, I had seen a wonderful video by Ryan Hollinger talking about the first one and how it's more of a murder mystery thriller type of film, and I love those, so I thought maybe I can actually handle this film. I had heard the plot from various different places in the past and vaguely knew all of the twists. The other reason that I wanted to finally watch Saw was because I saw that there were 2 Lost alums in the show, and I had been watching Lost at the time for the first time ever as well. Clearly I missed the early 2000s. I actually did really enjoy the film, despite kind of knowing where it was going. My one criticism is that I really don't get where people see, especially the first film, playing into the trap idea that Saw is so famous for. I don't see the traps as being related to the character's shortcomings in any particular way in the first movie. I did end up watching the second one, which I'll talk about. The next thing I watched was another comfort film, but a classic that I think most people can appreciate, and that is The Princess Bride. This film has 9 stars from me because it is a camp comedy fantasy classic that many of us watched on many a sick day. As a child, I definitely had this movie memorized at one point and still remember most of it by heart. It's such a good film, and it holds up over time because it doesn't invest too heavily in its special effects being quality, and it has that sort of campy, humorous vibe where you're not supposed to take anything about it too seriously. The next film I might have a bit of a controversial opinion on because it is closely related to Promising Young Woman, which I watched in January. So the film I want to talk about is MFA from 2017. I ended up giving this movie 6 stars as opposed to Promising Young Woman's 9 stars from me. Ultimately, I couldn't escape comparing the two. It is there in the marketing, it is there in the reviews on Letterboxd that these films are very similar. However, the reasons that I think MFA is not as good as Promising Young Woman, a lot of it comes down to how graphic the film is and how much the films put bystanders on trial. So, MFA, trigger warning, sexual assault, includes the actual graphic act of sexual assault itself on screen. And one of the things I really appreciated about Promising Young Woman was that they did not include that actual scene, and that it can be very triggering to see it. And sometimes it can be triggering to hear about it. And so I just didn't think it was necessary to show in graphic detail to get their point across. In fact, I think one of Promising Young Woman's most strong achievements is by giving you the impact long term that the assault can have on the person who's assaulted's life and also on those around them as well. Another thing that I think Promising Young Woman does better is that it puts rape culture on trial. It says even nice people, or people who think that they're good people, who stand by and watch it happen, or don't believe people's accusations, are ultimately facilitating this culture, and therefore also deserve punishment of some sort. I ultimately think MFA is much more of a boilerplate rape revenge fantasy that is certainly less exploitative than the films of the 70s that tackled the same subject, but it's pretty boilerplate, whereas Promising Young Woman does some very interesting things to call out red flag behaviors that lead up to sexual assault and to put bystanders in particular on trial. And so I think it's a stronger film for that. It has more nuance. The next one is another comfort film. In fact, there's a whole slew of comfort films that are coming up. And this one's Anastasia from 1997, the animated, and I gave it 9 stars. I love everything about this movie, the music, the story, the way that they have made the story mythologized and supernatural, and I just really enjoy watching this film. The next 3 films are all related, and that is The Mighty Ducks, D2 The Mighty Ducks, and D3 The Mighty Ducks. And I really like the Mighty Ducks franchise. I was preparing to watch Game Changers when I had Disney Plus at my sister's house. The Mighty Ducks is a very strong franchise in my opinion. I really enjoy the underdog story, the way that the characters all have unique sort of personalities and issues and little storylines within each of the movies. And I was very excited for Game Changers, which I also very much enjoyed. I thought keeping Stephen Brill on really helped them avoid characters falling into the same types as the original trilogy in a great way. The next thing I watched was The Secret Life of Pets. I gave this 6 stars. I'd seen it before. It's just really cute, and I watched it mostly for my niece. The next thing that I watched was Mortal Kombat. This was the 2021 version on HBO Max. I just watched it because it was on in the room, and I didn't really have any feelings about it. I gave it 5 stars, as in it's aggressively mediocre. My biggest criticism is that the last brutality is not very brutal, and I felt like it should be building up to a more brutal brutality. Some of the gore and fight scenes were really well done, but it was really just about that. The story was very average. Crank from 2006. I really enjoy Crank. It's the second time I was watching it with my friends, and it's just such a fun movie in like the worst, most aggressively action-filled sort of way. It knows what it is, and it goes over the top with what it is, to the point where it's a satire. It's a satire of these action movies that have no point other than violence and to keep going. And they build that into the premise in such a way that it makes sense. My friend said it's what happens when you let the stunt coordinator direct the movie, and the aesthetic really shows that. Everything is constantly moving, and there's such a great pace, weird visuals happening throughout, and I really enjoy the film a lot. The next thing I watched was Saw 2. I decided, well, the first one wasn't that bad, so maybe the second one also won't be that bad. And I was right about that fact. I didn't think it was super gory. I know that Saw was the franchise that kicked off the torture porn genre, and there was a little more of that in the second film. But I thought that the second film had a solid premise. I gave it 7 stars, but I did see more how they related to the characters' issues and shortcomings in a great way. I liked the sort of bottle episode premise for all of the victims to be trapped in this house and not know each other. I thought that was really good. And the twist was something I actually didn't see coming this time. I had not heard anything about the twist in this particular film. Overall, I thought there were some good gore scenes. The scene with the needles was a lot, but otherwise I didn't feel like it was too much. There's a good amount of kind of cutting away when it gets intense. The next film I watched was Braid from 2018. And I feel like I was maybe not in the right headspace to enjoy this as much as I could have. Or just the setup looks like one thing, and then as the film moves on, it turns into something else. It starts as this thriller with a good setup and premise, and moves into being this sort of abstract, artistic, metaphorical sort of film, which I wasn't ready for. Was not really what I had in mind when I picked this particular film. And so since that threw me for a loop, I ended up giving it 6 stars. I might watch it again to see if I could understand the artistic side of it a little bit more, because I wasn't really prepared for that when I went in. But I think if you're prepared for that, it could be a really strong film. It's definitely something that I ultimately enjoyed watching. I wasn't mad that it was not what I thought it was going to be. I'm just a little confused, and it took me a while to catch up. And then the next thing that I watched was Donkey Punch from 2008. And I chose this because I wanted something to put on in the background, and I think it was a good film for that. I thought that it might be related to the Broken Britain trend of films from the late 2000s to early 2010s, and I think I was right in that respect. It's very much about teens being out of control, but more than that, it's about gender dynamics, which was something I wasn't really aware of going in. It's a horror thriller that again has some trigger warning sexual assault implications, and it is pretty aggressive in terms of the violence that you see. It's not super gory, and the scenes of actual violence are fairly limited. There's a lot of psychological dynamics at play, but I didn't feel that the characters were developed well enough to care about the psychology, which is one of the problems with doing these sorts of psychological thrillers. Is you have to care about the character's psychology in order to become invested in some way. So I gave it 5 stars. It was aggressively mediocre. Another film that I gave 5 stars is The Woman in the Window from 2021. I wanted to watch this before I got spoiled on it. A lot of people have been very, very negative about this film, and I think it warrants some criticism. Again, I gave it 5 stars, but I don't think it's as bad as people are saying. It has Amy Adams, and she's giving it her all. I do wish there was more Julianne Moore in the film. I don't think it's as bad as people are saying. If you have seen Rear Window or any sitcom from the 90s, you know going into this film that you're watching a ripoff of a ripoff of a ripoff in some senses. And yet, I thought that the agoraphobia and the psychological element that they added to the character's trauma made the story slightly more interesting and gave it a bit of a twist. Not enough to call it original by any means, but a little bit of a twist. I didn't really like the going back and forth of the gaslighting in the film, and I really thought that the third act fell apart very aggressively. Once we find out what's going on with the main character, the movie just needed to be over, in my opinion. This is why I say it's aggressively mediocre, because the parts that are good are mostly ripped off, and the only new thing that it brings to it is the psychology element. So I also watched this month the first 2 films of the Lord of the Rings trilogy again, and then finished it up in early June. I really love the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and this was actually my second time watching it within 6 months. I personally think that the first one is good because it gives us a lot of sense of the characters. There's some really cute moments, but there's not a lot of development towards the plot being taken care of in the film, so I gave it 7 stars, and I gave The Two Towers, which I watched later on, 8 stars, because I do think it moves the plot along and is really good at getting things going and building up the tension towards what the final movie is going to show us. With that being said, I ultimately tend to enjoy The Fellowship of the Ring a little bit more than The Two Towers because I like the characters, especially the hobbits. The next thing I want to talk about is Gabriel from 2014. I gave this 5 stars, although I think if I had been in the right headspace going into the film, I might have given it a higher score. It's really hard for me to say, because I was expecting something that was vaguely a thriller. I was pulled in by a promise of Rory Culkin, whom I love. I love all of the Culkin brothers. And it ended up not really being a thriller and more of an emotional drama. I might have been okay with that if I was in a different headspace and ready for something kind of emotional. The other thing that I struggled with this film is that it felt basically like the same story as one of my favorite films, Igby Goes Down, which also stars a Culkin brother, in this case Kieran. And I like that film a lot, but it has a more humorous bent and has a lot of nice, lighthearted, kind of quirky moments. And Gabriel was aggressively serious the entire time. I thought it was a beautifully shot film, and Rory did a really great job. There's some good acting in it, but ultimately it was not what I was looking for at the time, and I think that's colored my perception of the film quite a bit. The next thing I watched was J'ai tué ma mère, or I Killed My Mother, from 2009, and this is Xavier Dolan's first film. I really love Xavier Dolan, and I've been watching all of his films for the first time since I watched Tom at the Farm on the recommendation of Spooky Astronauts. And I have not disliked any of his films that I have seen so far at all. I've enjoyed all of them, including J'ai tué ma mère. However, J'ai tué ma mère has a lot of similarities to another film that I think is superior from him, which is Mommy. And Mommy came out several years later, so clearly he was building on the themes and the feelings that he was addressing in J'ai tué ma mère when he made that film. So I'm not going to criticize him too much for that. And I still gave J'ai tué ma mère 8 stars. I think it's a really good film. I personally really enjoyed watching it, and it was very emotional. I think it captures this sense of alienation from your parents that you have as an LGBTQ plus youth in your early teen years, when you're figuring yourself out and it's hard to come out to your parent who you know may not be accepting, and so it hurts your relationship in other ways as well and makes you disconnect from them. I know I personally had that experience, and so I thought he did a really good job of communicating that experience in this particular film. Mommy has a sort of different message and a different meaning to it, and that's why I think they both stand on their own as great films. I just think his film craft was more honed when he made Mommy, and so it's a little more nuanced and a little more interesting visually speaking, but they're both excellent films. The next thing I watched was Bo Burnham's Inside. A lot of my Letterboxd friends watched this. I watched it the day it dropped. Literally the night before it came out, I was thinking, why hasn't Bo Burnham released any comedy lately? Like, I love 8th Grade, and he was really great in Promising Young Woman, but I just really want more of his comedy, because I feel like it would be very cathartic right now. And then, literally the next day, this dropped, without me even realizing it was coming. I gave it 8 stars. I don't think it's for everyone, mostly because while it taps into the feelings that we all universally had during the pandemic, which is an impressive thing to do, some folks might not want to revisit those feelings, and I think that's a perfectly valid thing, especially as we're moving back into a somewhat normal life, at least in the United States. Maybe this would be more anxiety-provoking than cathartic for you, but I personally found it very cathartic. I also thought his skill as a filmmaker and his roots as a YouTuber really stuck out to me in this special, and it's definitely more of an art piece than a straight comedy special. Some of the sections are way more ironic than they are funny, but he's always been huge on irony, so it works for him. Ultimately, it is an amazing special, whether you're looking for comedy or tragedy. I already talked about Lord of the Rings, so instead I will talk about Pet. I'm on a bit of a Dominic Monaghan kick because of the Friendship Onion podcast coming out this month. If you haven't checked that out, do that. Pet is from 2016, and I really just don't ever want Dom to say Claire in an American accent ever again. As someone who just came off of watching Lost, it was very disorienting and not what I needed in my life. Aside from that, I had seen this film before, and when I watched it the first time, I gave it 6 or 7 stars, and I kept that rating the second time as well. I thought that it held up on a second viewing, even though the plot twists were already known to me and I knew how it was going to end, but that the horror of that last shot in the film is something that really sticks with you, and I think it makes the film stronger on the whole. Overall, I just enjoy it as a thriller horror experience. It's good to see Dom in a different kind of role as well, and so I had fun rewatching it kind of through that lens. And then finally, the last thing that I watched was another comfort movie, and that is Young Frankenstein from 1974. We love Mel Brooks. It gets 8 stars from me. I have a lot of nostalgia with this movie. It was a movie that my family and me would quote a lot growing up, and I just really enjoy all of the gags, especially the sight gags and the adult humor that I quoted without really understanding what it was when I was a kid. And it's just silly in a lot of ways, and the story is still the original kind of story, but the moments of humor give it such a good twist that it's enjoyable to watch in a way that maybe a straight retelling of that story would not be as interesting to watch. So thank you all for listening and watching my first video. I want to keep doing these sorts of videos as I'm dipping my toes into making videos. And let me know if you like it or not. And I have some other ideas for videos that are not just talking about what I watched. But first I want to see if anyone thinks my takes are interesting. But I'm currently watching a bunch of films in a specific subgenre that I thought would be interesting to talk about with a little bit of practice on my editing skills. So comment, subscribe, let me know what you think of my takes, even if you disagree. Just try and do so respectfully. And I hope that you all are doing well. Have a good one.